From exorbitant licenses to hidden maintenance fees, the supply chain industry is littered with rogue pricing strategies. As such, today we're going to try and shed a little bit of light on some of these practices and discuss what are the particularly bad ones to keep an eye out for. So Johannes, why is it that pricing strategies vary so much in the supply chain industry?
My interest, and I think it relates a lot to Lokad, is specifically to the pricing of supply chain software. And there we have something that is much more infrequent for most companies. So companies don't, every single week buy yet another piece of supply chain software. So those operations are done very infrequently. It might be twice per decade or something. And thus chances are that whoever is doing them is actually doing it for the first time in their career. And if it's not the first time in their career, the previous iteration was maybe a decade or two ago, and it's not necessarily super relevant to what they're doing now. They might have completely changed in terms of position inside the company. So it's very interesting. You have a highly asymmetric position where the software vendor has a lot of experience at selling, because they are hopefully closing something like one client a week. So for them, it is literally routine. But for the company who is purchasing, this is a relatively atypical event. And to be honest, depending on the type of software that you buy, it can be exceedingly diverse. I would say the world of enterprise software is like super diverse. And supply chain is also very large on its own and has a lot of diversity inside it as well.
Okay, so today we're going to kind of look at some of the more common pricing kind of practices out there. If we start off by single license, this idea that you buy the code and everything is kind of owned by you. So how well does that kind of work?
So that approach, I think, was peaked during the 80s or early 90s. So selling a license, it has a benefit for the company. It's an accounting trick. If you buy a license, a software license, then you can potentially put it as an asset in your book. So, the $1 million that you just paid to a software vendor, if you think of it as a license that you own and that then you put this as an asset in your book, it kind of looks like if you just say, okay, I paid this vendor $1 million, and now I have an asset of $1 million. Accounting-wise, it costs nothing. So obviously, the money has been spent, and you're not going to recover. And if you think that your license that you have purchased for $1 million is worth $1 million, just try reselling it, just to get I would say, an accurate perspective on its actual market price. So if it's even possible, because contractually you might buy a license, but it might not be transferable or resellable. So bottom line, I think this approach peaked in popularity in the 80s, 90s, because I would say partly because of this accounting trick, partly because it was very simple, and it was actually the way things were purchased, in general by companies. If you need to purchase a new building, not rent it, purchase it, you expect to just pay a one-time fee and be done with it. If most of the things that a company acquire, it's a one-time payment for something. So in this respect, software, it was just aligning software with the rest. The problem is that it comes with many problems. And I think the biggest problem of all in the software industry with this license problem is that you have a massive take the money and run problem. And the take the money and run is that once you've paid a big license to a vendor, what incentive does this vendor has to actually keep improving the product? If you look at, for example, a company like Microsoft who is selling upgraded versions of, let's say, Microsoft Excel, every 2 years or 3 years they resell a new version, but it's supposed to be an improvement over the previous one, and people are sometimes, if the improvement is large enough, willing to upgrade, and they have been playing this game for decades, but it means that you are playing a game where you have enough innovation and progress so that every 2 or 3 years, you can have a new version and people see that the new version is sufficiently better so that they buy. But in supply chain, where it's kind of broken, is that deploying supply chain software is so expensive, so complex that you're not going to redeploy an ERP or an MRP or a WMS every 3 years. That would be crazy.
If we look at maybe another practice that's fairly common, particularly with the larger vendors, is this idea of maybe trying out a piece of software for free and then maybe a little bit further down the line deciding if it actually fits your company or not. Sounds like a very nice idea. It's nice to try something out before you buy it, but does it really work in practice?
The problem with supply chain software is that supply chain is a complex distributed system, distributed many locations, many people, many processes. So the idea that you can, test anything is, I believe, not realistic. As soon, it will be like saying, can you test out a WMS, warehouse management system? Well, you have only so many warehouses. If you have a very large companies, you might have 50 warehouses, but each one of them tend to be big. So even testing, a new WMS for one warehouse, it's going to be a massive effort. It's going to be literally months of efforts. You will have to retrain probably, dozens, if not 100 or more operators. So you see, the idea that you can have anything for free is I would say, very odd. And the problem is that some vendors, especially those who are selling licenses, they know that. They know that even if they give you a license for free, free trial, free as in free beer, no, not open source, basically you will have to invest, a lot of time and effort to just deploy your gratis software, not free, I prefer the term gratis. And then the idea is that once you've invested so much, it's very hard for people psychologically to call it a day and say, okay, it's not working, sunken cost, and not pay the license. They are committed to the initiatives they have started, and there you can end up in a very bad situation where you're committed to a piece of software, but because it was gratis, you've not really negotiated the price yet. So, and remember, this is not like PowerPoint where there is a license price where it's like $100 for the license per user, and this is it, where it's like super simple. We're talking of enterprise software. So you will always find, shenanigans where suddenly the vendor will decide that the price can be something different. And one very simple way to do that, by the way, that's what some enterprise vendors are doing, is to have a very simple public price. That is absurd. So obviously, you have your public pricing that is absurdly high. So the reality is that when after 1 year of free trial with this vendor, you realize that the price is absurdly high. And by the way, the vendor never lied to you. The price was public, no problem. It was just absurd, but it was public. Your fault. So now the real price that you're going to pay is going to be a negotiation. And it can be, really a fraction, only a tenth of what the public price would be. But the problem is at your point where you're in a very, very weak position to negotiate because you've invested so much. The vendor knows that you have invested so much. And they know that you have also not only the amount of resource, but also and extra, but also the opportunity cost. You've 1 year later, so you've kind of lost all this time to do something else. And you're now very, very late. And so changing a vendor because you refuse this deal that is under negotiation, I mean, it's very difficult. And thus you can, as a vendor, get away charging, price, I would say charging fees that would have been almost unthinkable for the company if it had been like the starting point of the relationship of discussing that.
But you say there's kind of these shenanigans going on, but at the end of the day, like our customers, they talk on forums, they already get kind of an idea about pricing before they buy. So surely people already kind of have this understanding that might happen before they even buy it.
No, it's very taboo. I mean, it's very funny. It's actually, there are many vendors who even put in their contract clauses that says that you're not allowed to publicly, state the price. So you have like an NDA that actually covers the price of the solution. That's relatively frequent. But even when that is not in place, the incentives are not, are never to communicate broadly on that. I mean, for many, many reasons. I mean, first, imagine this is supply chain we are talking about. So in the people who are in the operations, those people, they are not paid fortune. So it's very hard if you have people that have like minimal wages. When you tell them that the software they are using, is worth millions, they may question whether the company is investing its money in the right direction. Why not, raise the wages a bit instead of pouring so much money on abstract stuff that doesn't seem, very, very real. But then it's not the only thing. Is that as a manager, if you kind of know that you've negotiated a poor deal with a vendor, are you really super willing to, widely advertise that you've been a poor negotiator? It's not exactly if you are an IT director and that you had you've deployed a new ERP. It's a great success, but it costs to the, let's say you have a large company that does a few billions worth of turnover every year, and deploying the new ERP costed, let's say, $100 million. It's extravagant compared to the turnover of the company. And yet, I mean, it might be, a nice thing. The project went well, extra, but it's still kind of extravagant. It's hard. It's much easier as being the CTO of the company to just say, oh, we have done, something great with our teams on this new project, as opposed to, broadcast the fact that it costs, a ridiculous amount of money.
Okay, and then somewhere in between, kind of the middle ground between sort of trying it out for free and then paying a huge license fee, is this idea of pay as you go. And you can have kind of pay as you go both in terms of man days, but also in terms of computational cost. How well does that work? It seems like kind of a nice middle ground.
The problem that I see with this pricing is, it is very nice in a way, but it's very technical and completely disconnected from the added value from a supply chain perspective. So if I tell a client, I'm going to charge you by bandwidth, CPU, SSD storage, and HDD storage, the client is going to say, well, how does those things even relate to the problem that I'm currently interested in, which is optimizing my supply chain? So I believe, the pay-as-you-go in terms of computing resources is only of interest actually for tech vendors, for people who have, I would say, who have an absolute focus on the tech himself, and so they know if what they are buying is a good price. Because the other thing is that with pay-as-you-go for computing resources, and that's the problem with, by the way, this pricing model with IBM, is that, guess what? Even if you buy, your computing resources at a price that is fair right now, as of, end of July 2020, what would make you think that this price is going to be anywhere fair 5 years from now? And the answer is that most likely it won't. And by the way, and that was literally the big problem with IBM, where IBM was selling MIPS at a price point that was basically the cost of computing power, let's say, at the early 80s. And 20 years later, they have lowered a bit their price, but companies realize that they are paying, they end up paying every second of compute power, or for compute power of something that is less than a smartphone, several dollars. So it's as if you were renting the equivalent of the processing power of a smartphone for several dollars per second of smartphone computation. It doesn't make any sense. And literally, by the way, this problem is also happening on the cloud, where typically cloud vendors, they start with a price pay-as-you-go for the computing resources that is very aggressive at launch, and then they just don't lower the price fast enough. So people who adopt those technologies, they end up with something that 5 years down the road is not that competitive, because maybe the tech has progressed so much faster than the pricing of the cloud vendor. Then you have the other way. The other problem is that pay-as-you-go for people. And that's typically when you have like I would say a setup, that's typically a sort of setup that you have with integrators. So supply chain software is very complex, and thus you typically end up with a lot of customization. And thus what happens is that you frequently you end up paying licenses to software vendors. But then you have also the integrators who are doing a lot of work, and they are typically paid in man days. And the big problem that I see with as soon as you start charging man days is that you have like a massive incentive for mediocre productivity. You know, every single thing needs to be done as slow as possible. Just because if this problem can be solved in 1 week, well, if you can solve it in 1 month, you charge 1 month. So you see, you end up with this massive disalignment of interest between the integrator or the IT company who is charging, you know, for every day that they spend, and the company who basically earn value, added value by like features delivered or, you know, improvement brought to the system.
Okay, and one of the great ways to kind of bring alignment between those two parties then is through success fees, and the idea that if a piece of software really actually gives a company real added value, then both companies can kind of profit from that. That sounds very much to me like a win-win scenario for both parties, but is it in reality?
So that's a very good question. In theory it works, but in practice it doesn't. The quote, the actual quote is, in theory and practice should be the same, but in practice they are not. So the problem with success fees is that on paper it looks very good. You have a commitment with the vendor. We choose KPIs and we say, you know what? If we do something and you prove that you're going to save, $100, let's say, for example, the company is going to get $80 and the vendor is going to get $20. That's super cool. The problem is that I believe it's completely dysfunctional, completely dysfunctional in practice for actually a whole series of reasons. The first thing is that it's completely psychological. The sheer amount of stress that it puts in the relationship. You end up, if you have like a big success, you end up in a situation where potentially you're going to put huge fees on the vendors. And although in theory, everybody would be rational extra, when you're dealing with a large company and you can end up with $100 million of savings, the idea of paying a vendor 20 billion, it looks, on paper it looks great. In practice, when you end up having to sign a check and this $20 million is going to double the budget of the supply chain, organization, not the expenditure and whatnot, it's very, very different. And then you end up with also things where you're terrorized, where if you got the KPI wrong, and you will get it wrong, you can end up, paying absurd amount of money to a third party on things that are unwarranted, because the problem is that you can game the metrics. You choose a metric, and then you realize that the vendor can game the metric, so they can actually generate a very big number according to this KPI of success that you've decided, but actually it's not a win for the company, but it's certainly a win for the vendor. So it's very difficult. So you have a massive amount of distrust. That is, in theory, the alignment, the KPI would create the alignment. In practice, it kind of amplify any kind of distrust that was like pre-existing. And then it's not the only problem, because the problem also is that you have an asymmetry that is very hard to reconcile. What if the solution of the vendor end up making it worse? Are you actually going to charge the vendor? If, for example, instead of being like plus 100 million, it's actually minus 100 million, it did make things worse and generate a lot of cost. Is the vendor going to pay you? I've never seen that. So basically you have something that is highly asymmetric where, okay, you toss a coin, head, we both win, tail, you lose, I don't. So, it's skewed. It's literally, there is this kind of moral hazard going on that is not good. And so what happens, and I've seen that multiple times, is that with competitors that literally went bust with that, was year one, yes, you achieve a great success, everybody is happy. Year 2, you end up with the company saying, no way, we are paying again this massive success fee. This is a new standard. So now, if you want to have another success fee, it should be the improvement compared to what we have now. And the vendors say, it's so hard to even maintain this new level of performance that we don't get anything. We have kind of exhausted our low-hanging fruits, and now we have like the new performance of the supply chain, but we can't generate those $100 million of extra saving, every year. And so basically you end up having like a massive disagreement. And I've seen, many companies even going to court with that, just because, it's irreconcilable. At some point, you end up with a vendor that says, just to maintain this level of performance with regard of this KPI, etc., I need to work a lot, but according to success fee, I'm not paid. So you end up, it's broken by design.
Okay, and one of the tools you kind of mentioned earlier, Microsoft Excel. One of the things that Microsoft do very well with Microsoft Office is this idea of charging per user, and they don't charge very much, but when you've got a whole company of people using it, it soon kind of mounts up. For me, that sounds like probably the fairest way to do it. How does that work if it was a supply chain piece of software?
So again, not very well. The reality is that when you charge per user, you have basically, I'm simplifying, but you have basically 2 ways of going at it. One is the Microsoft Office way, where basically you charge a very low fee, something like $10 per month, and basically you kind of expect that the company will take, will equip the entire customer base, and you expect that there will be very little cheating. So basically, every single employee will get a license out of sheer convenience, because actually cheating would be way more expensive and complicated. And so you charge that, and basically, because it's very cheap, companies are going to take this license for everybody, no matter whether they are really using the software or not. And then you have, I would say, on the other end of the spectrum, the high-end professional software. So that would be, let's say, Katia from Dassault Systèmes, for computer-aided design. And there you can end up with something where you charge literally $5,000 per month per user. Microsoft Visual Studio is something like $5,000 per year per user. So I mean, there is still a wide range of pricing, but it's very expensive. And here, what you expect is that companies will do the following. They will only equip the strict minimum number of people. So they will only take, people from this single role and equip them with that. And vendors know that to some extent, people will cheat. It's not like massive fraud. It's just that, let's say you have like a piece of software that is very expensive. If you have a colleague that only needed, one day a month, he will just use, he will use the same computer where this guy or this guy on vacation, he will just, swap, with a desk and use the machine of somebody who is in vacation at this point of time. But these sort of things where you expect that people will do something a bit fringe to kind of lower the cost by having multiple users on the same license, but they are not going to massively abuse that. It's not like they are going to have like 100 person per seat, but they are going to have, let's say, 1.3 people per seat or something, and it's fair. And actually, the vendors knows it, and they charge accordingly. So it's fine. So now, what's the problem with supply chain? So again, if we go back to supply chains, where as we defined it, in a previous episode, where mastery of optionality facing variation, the thing is that you have only a few people who are truly involved with, I would say, supply chain in the sense of supply chain optimization, and you have way more people that are involved in the sense of supply chain execution. And supply chain execution is everything, transport, manufacturing, purchasing, all sorts of things. So the problem is that if you opt for a software that gives you a price per user that is really the price for your specialist, the problem is that you're going to pay a lot per user. It's okay because there is only a few specialists that are, the people doing the forecasting and these sort of things. but they need to share the results broadly with almost the entire company. So you end up with something that is very dysfunctional, where if you end up with a per user price, due to the nature of supply chain software, it's typically not for the whole company. So it's going to be a few seats, very expensive software per user. It's fine. But then you end up with a tension that actually almost everybody else in the company wants to have access to that, if only to gain access to the results, because they need that to basically execute the synchronization, and so you end up with this massive amount of friction, and overall, it's not good. So you need to have a thinking where it's kind of company-wide, pretty much by default.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground. It certainly sounds like the pricing strategies out there. It's a bit of a minefield. Maybe to conclude, it's probably worth just talking about the pricing strategy we chose at Lokad. It's this idea of a fixed monthly fee, no implementation costs, no kind of tie-in to any kind of contract. When I first joined, that was something that I thought of as being fairly risky. Maybe you could just sort of conclude by just sort of telling us why you thought that was a good approach to take.
So I didn't thought it was a good approach. Historically, we did everything else. And then by a sheer process of elimination, we did end up with this pricing model. I mean, Lokad was started from day one with pay-as-you-go for computing resources. We were charging, believe it or not, by the forecast, or one number. So we were charging by how many forecasts in the sense of numbers associated to a forecast we were producing. That was literally how Lokad was charging for the first 3 years. It was completely dysfunctional. And we did explore all the other alternatives, charging per Mondays, charging with success fees. It went terrible, absolutely terrible. And the problem is that it went terrible for success fees, although it was a big success. So it was, in terms of operation, it was very successful. Technologically, it was a big success. It was working. End users were happy. And everybody was terrified, and the amount of distrust was just insane. That was probably the most toxic relationship we ever got into with a client, just due to the sheer amount of stress generated by the success fee. So we literally tried all those things. Charging for license, we realized that when we do that, we can't maintain. It's such a crappy situation, etc. So literally, I didn't thought of any pricing model. We just tested literally everything until we decided to try something that was like weird, that was not, but it was after exhausting all the rest. And what was exhausting all the rest, it was, well, we are just going to charge a flat monthly fee. That's it. No, and it's going to be all-inclusive. Yeah, all-inclusive. And why? And it has worked very, very well. So the way we price nowadays is we have a company that comes to us. Basically, we look at pretty much two things. The complexity of the problem. So, and that is independent from the scales. Do you have MOQs? Do you have a multi-sourcing? Do you have price breaks? Do you have one ERP, two ERPs, 27 ERPs, one for countries, etc. So, what is the complexity of the landscape we are trying to address? And then, what is the scale? Are we talking of a $20 million company or a $20 billion company? Because obviously, if you're much bigger, you want to achieve a much higher level of optimization. Optimizing down to the last percent when you're a $20 million company, it's not worth it. When you're 20 billion, even 1% or 0.1% is a huge amount of money. So basically, we look at complexity and scale, and we end up with kind of flat pricing. And what are the benefits? Well, in terms of incentive, first, we have to invest. It costs more for the setup. There is no workaround. Initially, the cost is higher, but by having a flat fee, we don't charge for a higher fee at the beginning. We don't get this incentive of take the money and run. And for me, as a CEO of Lokad, I realized that it was great because it was a way to make sure that for Lokad, for me, and for all our teams, and including you, Karen, we have no way to run. The only way to have something that is profitable at the end of the day is to have the client that stays with us for literally years. Actually, our own internal calculation, we want to have something that breaks even, that's our own recipe, at 2 years. So we know where the client pay us right from the first month, but for the client to break even, we need to have those 2 years period. So the client needs to stay with us for 2 years to even break even. We can even think that it's insane, but the way I see that is that way we know that when we are not doing something great, there will be pain, and we will know it. So it's not something where you just sell a license, the client, it doesn't work for the client, the situation is it's terrible, but for you as a vendor, it's great. So you see, so we share the pain. We can't really align, things like success fee, but we can align the fact that we will share the pain if it goes wrong. And that, I think, in a way, it's very important. So first, that gives us this very strong incentive. The second thing that it does is that people think it gave us, over time, a very strong incentive to keep, improving the solution, whether the client ask for it or not, because we are fundamentally paid over and over, and we want to basically, lower our cost. And what are our costs? Our costs are, the computing resources. So obviously, because what we are earning is a flat fee, it's us who have to basically improve the software so that it's more performant, so that we don't waste computing resources. That's the opposite of pay-as-you-go for computing resources. And also, we are providing, maintenance, part of the package. So we want to make sure that this maintenance is as cheap as possible. So literally, this is part of this insurance model where I think it's kind of the zen of supply chain. You have something, Lokad charge a flat fee. The client can leave anytime. So you have no commitment, typically. And we have to prove month after month that we are good, and we are completely at risk. That's the interesting thing, is that Lokad is at risk any month of the client leaving us. And the only stickiness that exists is just because clients trust the performance that we achieve. Over several months and then over years, they requires high degree of trust that this level of performance is not accident, that it's very hard to replicate. And although the grass is always greener on the other side, it's not anywhere clear that they would get anywhere close to this degree of performance if they were going anything else. Although contractually, they can close the contract pretty much any single day.
Okay, I love that description, kind of the zen of supply chain, but I'm also a little bit worried that I can't run anywhere now. Okay, we'll have to wrap it up there, but thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.